So good morning, everybody. I'm Murdoch McAllister here, and welcome to the Oceans and Fisheries Quantitative Seminar. And today we'll have Tom Carruthers giving the seminar. He has basically been in the field of science since about 2001. He started as BSc in Marine Biology, University of Plymouth, Southern England. He then went on to Australia, University Sydney, and did a MSc in experimental ecology with somebody called, I think, Tony Underwood. I think that's correct, isn't it, Tom?
That's right. And then it went downhill after that.
Yeah, but then it went on to Imperial College, and I was Tom's PhD supervisor, at least to start before I left for UBC. So Tom completed his PhD 2006, just a 3-year PhD. That was really a great standard to set in terms of 3 years, but that's what they tend to do in the UK. And I think out of his PhD, Tom eventually published a couple of papers. Tom was a research associate at UBC for almost 10 years, from 2008 to 2017. So basically he was a research associate in the Fishery Center and then into the IOF, and ran a bunch of really big projects. One of the bigger ones being on data limited tools, like tools for setting catch limits, where you have not a lot of data, but some information about biology, and you have a time series of catch, perhaps, at least, in some effort, maybe. Tom may talk about that a little bit. And Tom was appointed as assistant professor without review, though, in the IOF. So that couldn't last that long, but it started in 2017, and then in 2020, Tom moved on to become, I guess, the head of this new company, Blue Matter Science, which specializes in fisheries quantitative consulting, modeling. And Tom is also an adjunct professor for the IOF. So Tom has a lot of expertise in quantitative analysis, like stock assessment modeling. He does a lot of work on management strategy evaluation on the ground and developing really neat software for that in a whole variety of situations. And you'll hear about that today in his talk. And Tom's published over 50 refereed papers so far in his career. So I'll just put it over to Tom.
Thanks, Murdoch. You weren't mean at all. It's disappointing. I hope I get to introduce you one of these days. We'll see how that goes. So hi, everybody. Thanks for turning up. Where to start? I'll tell you, the subtitle to this is Notes from the Depths of the Atlantic Bluefin Tuna MSc. Well, I can tell you, I've been up since 2:30 in the morning today with the Atlantic Bluefin Tuna MSc working group. I'm up at 2:30 in the morning for the next few days too. So you'll excuse me if I'm a bit deranged, or at least more deranged than usual. Today, I just want to preface this talk by saying I'm no expert, okay, not really, on spatial multi-stop seasonal models, but I would say that very few people are. And I've heard a lot of experts say things which are demonstrably wrong when it comes to spatial and seasonal and multi-stop dynamics. So I'm no expert. The idea today is I'm going to talk you through my experiences. I've worked on Fraser River sturgeon in a spatial context. I've worked with Atlantic Bluefin tuna, but also trout and tropical tuna. So I've got some experience, and I've checked most of the material you're going to see today with people that have done similar. So I'm fairly confident that the tone of this talk is going to be roughly how other people who are working in this area feel. This is not going to be a seminar which is of the typical introduction methods results. This is more of a kind of lessons learned, and hopefully it won't be as painful as some of the other lessons learned presentations I've had to join. But it's going to be dense, and it's going to be quantitative, and it's going to be a bit nerdy. So I don't know, take a big gulp of your coffee and see if you can keep up with me, because I've got quite a lot to say on this issue. What's the good news? Well, the good news is if you're considering a model like this, you've got a good point. And that is just simply put that we know that substock structure exists and multi-stock structure exists within the same species. we know this is a big issue because every time we see it, for example, in, let's say, Pacific salmon or in Atlantic bluefin tuna, you just name it, any place it crops its head up, we see how important it is for our understanding of the system and also the implications for management advice. So this is a big deal. And it's, you know, you think about some of the most valuable fisheries on Earth, like tropical tunas, and there's evidence that substock structure, you know, changed very quickly in the early parts of the fisheries, and we've never got it back. And those, in those resources, that's completely skewed the way we look at them. So this is a big deal. And so I'm going to insert a slightly snarky slide here, and this is just to make the point that once you understand how important something like this is, and I remember Ray was giving a talk about this in part about a few weeks ago, everyday interactions that you have with managers and scientists start to seem a little bit ridiculous because this is an elephant in the room, and there's a whole bunch of other elephants in the room that we know are likely to be very important, but often we just simply don't have the data to characterize them. And so sorry for the snarky slides, but you do find this kind of stuff going on all the time. And, you know, the way we do fisheries modeling, there are serious questions about some of the assumptions that we make. Not only is it an important issue, there's, in theory, just for the basic schematic, some analytical benefits. If we've got two different stocks we're modeling, we can finally start to model non-independence in their dynamics, which is important across a wide range of different fisheries. That seems quite important. Another thing we can do is that in any time where they're exploited by the same fleet, we can share parameters potentially. So we can construct parsimonious models that fit into the same types of data. And in the same way, we can start to interpret data correctly because we can account for the influence of multiple different species, for example, on acoustic surveys or spawning biomass indices and other things. I've got a note here to talk about mutual exclusivity. A big deal here is that independently in these two stocks, you might have scenarios for high and low abundance, let's say. But when you put them together, the high example for both and the low example for both are mutually exclusive. So in actual fact, you still only have two scenarios instead of four when you combine them. So multi-stock modeling also narrows the range of plausible hypotheses, which is another sort of fringe benefit that you get. It's also really popular with biologists, and that's important because a large number of the people that are going to fund and support your work are biologists. I'm a biologist, and they will say in categorical terms, this must be done. We must have stock structure, we must have spatial and seasonal dynamics. And of course, the modeling team just sits there going, well, you want it, but is it possible, right? And I'm unfortunately one of the modeling team over there that sort of just grimaces when people ask for things for which I'm sure they've got good grounds for doing it, but technically it's not possible, or there may not be the data to do it. So you've got a serious problem, but you're going to get support from a big crowd of people that are generally involved in the scientific process of fisheries. Another thing that's nice about it is you can pitch them pretty easily because you can create quite nice schematics. And there's nothing quite like a spatial model when you superimpose it over a map to give it the appearance of some, you know, factual veracity, you know, and people make a huge amount of their whole careers on making, you know, essentially model data points look real just because they're superimposed on a map. You're seeing everything you need to know about bluefin tuna dynamics. So you've got a western stock over here with a natal area, it's exclusive natal area in the Gulf of Mexico. And over here, you've got an eastern stock with a natal area in the Mediterranean. And they mix throughout the North Atlantic throughout the year. And the other thing you need to know is the western stock is roughly an order of magnitude smaller. The western stock is an order of magnitude smaller than the east. So that just about covers everything you need to know about bluefin tuna for the purposes of this seminar. But as you look at this diagram, you'll find yourself sucked in to it, you know, and this is why you can sort of convince a sponsor, because they just look at this stuff and they're like, we must fund your spatial seasonal model. It's hypnotizing, and like I say, you can get money to do it. So that's the good news. You've got a serious problem you're addressing. It's popular amongst a good portion of scientists, and you can get money to do it. What more do you want? This is great. Well, the bad news is that all of a sudden you're struck with reality. And the reality is that even in very simplified fishery models, we have a lot of trouble going about our business of estimating model parameters and making predictions and other things. And you can, all these ideas, these notional benefits you might have, and all the glamour of these high concepts that I've just presented to you are going to just get completely thrown out of the way, because all you're going to be worrying about for the next God knows how long is just practical nitty-gritty stuff. Like, how are you going to parameterize your model? Does it reliably estimate parameters? And you'll see throughout these slides, I've got some blue text, which is kind of a recommendation. I'm really trying not to be patronizing here. I'm just giving you my recommendation. It may not be the best thing to do, but I'm going to try it and try not to find it patronizing. But your job basically is going to be one of saying to other people, we're going to start simple, and you tell me why and what grounds we've got for adding it, and I'll check as we go through. It's a super important perspective because it's going to guard you against a whole range of other problems down the line. Another problem is when you get into the results of a multi-stock spatial analysis, suddenly they're not very easy to interpret. And not only are they not very easy to interpret, they're often very problematic for managers. Suddenly, hard decisions have got to be made. And what you're going to find is the same biologists and ecologists, that's me by the way, who like this thing, don't want to let go of it. But at the same time, the managers are just kind of want to forget it ever happened, because it creates all these difficult trade-offs. So just something to be aware of, get into this in a management setting where people are prepared for these types of outcomes, because it can be really tricky. So what I've done here is another snarky slide. This is my psychological roadmap for spatial modeling. And basically it's, you can see it's in sort of color-coded according to mood. So you'll start off with this, honeymoon period of talking about the science and the theory and everything else. And very quickly that'll be over when you look at the types of data you've actually got. That's the yellow data sparsity. And suddenly the mood descends and continues to descend through a series of stages where at the very end of it, insult to injury, someone's going to ask you to actually defend what you've done. And so this I've checked against a bunch of spatial modelers, and this is reasonably consistent with what I've heard, especially if they're involved in big processes. My job today, as I've seen it in this conversational quantitative seminar, is to try and protect you against the red stuff here. That hopefully I can give you advice and ideas that might get you to just yellow, possibly. And so this is intended to be helpful, this talk. And what I've done is I've split it into a set of sections, which are really the agenda, but they're also a decision tree for trying to navigate your way through this pretty daunting modeling type of exercise. So the first one is, you don't need to read these now because we're going to go through them one by one, but is it really necessary in the very first place? You've got to really think carefully about this because, and people don't, but there's plenty of grounds for suggesting that you should do multi-stock modeling. I mean, anytime when you set a TAC on a group of species and you know they've got different vulnerabilities to fishing or different productivity dynamics, you can make it a case that you should be modeling them independently. And especially if they've got non-independence between them. So, for example, one affects the growth of another and so on. There's might be, and particularly a two-way situation. Because if you really think about it, it's one way, you can model that stock and you could probably model how it's projected to influence the other one. So you don't need to necessarily do them together. But if they compete for food, let's say, or their growth is not independent, now you've got an issue. And so my only thing here is I should be super clear about why you need to do it. I would say half of the multi-stock models I've seen done were unnecessary in actual fact. And they could have probably been done separately. Another even more dubious extension is multiple areas. It's surprising how narrow the range of scenarios are where you actually have to do spatially explicit modeling, and as opposed to sort of implicit spatial modeling. You can, generally speaking, format your data and interpret your data in a way that it's okay to assume things are mixed. And you can imagine there are some exceptions. So for example, where area is interacting with the non-independents in the stocks. Picture those bluefin diagrams where they mix in different places at different times. And also, if you want to evaluate area-based kind of management, you need to be able to characterize those dynamics. But it's surprisingly narrow, the range of circumstances in which you might need to consider multiple areas explicitly. In terms of seasonal dynamics, again, it's tricky. Really, if you've got something super short-lived, you're probably using in-season management anyway. If you're considering in-season management, you're going to need a seasonal model probably. But again, for the most part, seasonal structure, you have to be really careful before going that way. And there's a bunch of models in the Indian Ocean I've been reviewing where they go for a quarterly model for these tunas. I just can't see a sensible reason for it. I think it's just someone's turned a knob in stock assessment software, basically. So be very, very clear about why you do these things. And moreover, bear in mind that to some extent or other, these types of issues may be a possible dynamic in lots of fish populations. What matters is whether it's necessary. And so before you embark on this stuff, definitely work out what you mean by necessary. Not just whether or not it could be happening, but what do you mean? And in this context, and the context of this talk, necessary means will impact your management decision making. So it doesn't matter if it gives you different estimates, it just won't affect the way that you think your management's going to function. Decision tables, MSE, things like that. But let's say you go ahead and you think you've got grounds based on those types of questions. I would highly recommend anybody to do a research program that has a preliminary investigative stage in it, so you don't get embarrassed. Basically, what you want to know is that the thing's necessary and possible, and you can do it really quite quickly. So in plenty of stock situations or circumstances, people will say, we think the range of mixing between various areas is this much, between this value and this value. So you can just go ahead and do that. What I'm saying here is a very quick simulation test to make sure that really you've even got something to worry about in the first instance. And that can happen really quickly. So with the kind of software we're developing, you could do that in a few hours if you've already got a stock assessment. And that could save you a 3-year unnecessary research program, full of complications. And there are plenty of exemptions that people don't really fully appreciate. So one is that, if you have 10% mixing between areas, that's quite mixed. And you often have to demonstrate that to people. And that's why this quick simulation test is a good idea. Much of the time, people try and model a species that has roughly the same vulnerability or has the same kind of maximum exploitation rate, like an FMSY. And if that's the case, then really there are management solutions that don't actually warrant you doing the individual modeling. You could just have some index-based control rule. And then the seasonal exemption is obvious, like, how short-lived does it have to be to actually justify it? But again, do the simulation test quickly and dirty in a day to show that it does or doesn't make a difference before you even start. And so here's an example of one of those. So if you look up here to the top left-hand corner, you've got a simple movement matrix. So moving from areas 1 and 2 to areas 1 and 2. And all I've done is parameterize this with a theta, which is the probability of staying put in area 1 and the probability of staying put in area 2. And the rows sum up to 1 because fish are going from this to one of these 2 areas, so they have to sum to 1. And here we can see a scenario where the movement matrix looks like this for a 2-area model. And here we can see the outcomes. And I did this in 20 minutes before we did this before I gave this presentation. And all we're doing here is we're taking a fitted stock assessment model, and we've got now splitting it throughout its whole time series into 2 areas. And then we're saying in the future, what's the impact of this level of viscosity staying put in the same area, 99% of the fish are staying in their respective areas, with 0 fishing in area 1, with 25% of the TAC taken in area 1, with 33% of the TAC taken in area 1. And you can do this very quick exercise for a bunch of different values for this parameter. And this is exactly what happened in a case study that I previously dealt with, where we basically got to the conclusion that essentially it wasn't going to be consequential. That, you know, from these we could do projections of management and it wasn't going to make any difference whatsoever, because in fact they were closer to the theta as 0.9, so 90% of the fish staying put, and the discrepancy in TAC was only going to be up to 33%. So, you know, you can do these exercises super quickly, days, in a rough way, and it can really put to bed any complexity down the line that you'll be looking at, and I highly recommend it. But you've got something like bluefin, so you've decided it is necessary. The next question is, are you doing something silly trying to do all this at the same time? Is there any way in which you could just say, these are two different stocks and they don't need to deal with their independence? So if you can't think of a plausible reason why they should be independent, then why don't you just do how we deal with other catch problems, other stock assessment problems, and just split out the catch? If it's the same species, that means you need stock of origin. So you need some way of knowing which stock of the same species it came from. And, you know, so what's going to happen is you won't have complete stock of origin data, almost certainly, for dividing up your catches. Almost certainly won't. But the question is it worth going to the whole hassle of a multi-stock modeling approach if you could come up with credible scenarios for splitting up the catch? And, you know, so for bluefin, we have very patchy stock of origin data, so we fit it statistically. But you could argue that we could have, for the purposes of our operating models, just split up our catches and done independent stock assessments, and then gone about doing it that way. This is something that's a serious consideration, because it's going to, again, save you modeling problems down the line and stick to a much simpler way of doing business, and one that people understand as well. So this idea about dividing up multiple stocks, you need relatively complete stock of origin data, but think twice before just assuming you have to do this statistically, because you might be able to come up with scenarios for dividing up your catches. That's just a quick thing about dividing into stocks. But again, for bluefin, we can't do that. We've got incredibly patchy stock of origin data. The next consideration is, what's the purpose of these models that you've got? Because your considerations are really different. So for example, if you're going to do an operating model approach, you won't necessarily have to defend each and every single estimate that comes out of that model. You might have some spurious movement estimate, and at the end of it, you say, well, you know what? The management procedure we tested was robust to that. Who cares? It doesn't matter. And you can get away with that in MSE to a certain extent, but in stock assessment, you can't generally. Someone's going to ask you to defend that estimate. So for example, for bluefin tuna, here's some movement estimates. What you've got here is, as you've seen before, movement from a set of areas, here the Mediterranean, the East Atlantic, and so on, to a bunch of areas across the top. So this is another one of those matrices. And at the end, you've got the emergent spatial distribution that goes into the next season. So in just the Western stock, for what is the third age class, you've got a huge amount of information in here to look at. And most stakeholders and most biologists could look at this for a week and think of things they did and didn't like about it. Okay? And that's just one age class, one stock. If you look at the full grid, it looks like this. Now, you can just about get away with this in an operating model, but you will not be able to get away with it in a stock assessment. No way, because if the results are contentious, the review will come up and they'll ask you to defend this little orange square here or this little green square here, and you'll say, I don't know. And so the consideration with spatial modeling, and I think it's an important consideration, is only do it at a resolution that people can review and understand intuitively. If you do it at a more complicated one like this, you'll never be able to satisfactorily justify all of the estimates you've got out of it. It won't pass peer review. And in any good fishery setting, there's probably going to be some controversy, and you don't want that to be used against you. So just a little issue to do with whether or not using it for assessments or operating models. If it's assessments, go simpler, is what I'm saying. The next one's an issue to do with whether or not you really have to model little boxes or advection diffusion equations at all. It's about the assumptions that would prevent you from modeling this just in a traditional way using an approach called fleets as areas. So why can't you just say that we have different fleets in different places and we expect their vulnerability at age or length to interact with spatial and seasonal structure such that we can just say that's a reasonable representation of what happens in that area? And you can. And it's actually, again, it's something you want to simulation test because it's surprisingly robust. It doesn't get things spot on, but it very often gets very close. And arguments that are made against this approach of just having a single area model or a single season and having fleets work something along the lines of, we've got roughly parallel indices, so we can use this approach. And there's a problem with this conclusion, and that is that you can have parallel abundance indices amongst areas and amongst fleets, and actually then just be depleting those resources at the same rate. So it's not actually evidence for mixing. It's one of those necessary but not sufficient conditions. And so although you can plot your abundance indices or your CPU indices, it's never actually going to conclusively tell you whether or not there is mixing. It can only tell you whether there isn't. And so this argument's not fully sufficient to justify the use of a fleets as areas. The other problem is people would say, well, look at our tagging data, look at our survey, we see a roughly constant spillover into those fleet areas. Well, so what if it's inconsistent? If it's inconsistent, you should be calculating your abundance indices accordingly, and it should be just rolled into your stock assessment. It doesn't really matter what the regional vulnerable biomass is, as long as you calculate your indices correctly. So again, I go back to this though in general as a very good approach. It's just a tricky business without doing sim testing to know whether or not you're going to do something sensible. But anyway, so treating fleets as areas is a viable alternative, and it should be up to you to disprove doing this before you get into something more explicit. Of course, for bluefin, we can't do it because our fleets are fishing a mixed stock in a certain strata that changes over time and space. So we have no choice. We have to have explicit areas, we have to have seasons, and we have to have explicit fleets operating in those boxes. So we don't have that luxury. So is there anything you can do to make life simpler for yourself if you're considering a quite complicated model? A method that we developed for bluefin is a thing called a master index, and it's really useful, and I'll explain it as best I can right now. What if, using any old method possible, dubious or otherwise, or even getting people to draw it, you could sketch out the seasonal spatial abundance over time. So here we've got the Gulf of Mexico in Q1, and different colored lines are different approaches to deriving a master index. So let's just assume the red line is our master index. What we've got is an index standardized across season, area, and space. And that index is useful for a couple of reasons. First of all, everyone can see it. So a group can look at it and say, well, is this a reasonable starting point for estimation or similar? Like, could this be used to initialize a model? Another thing that's useful about it is people can actually propose alternatives. They can sketch them, or they can use different methods, and you can test the sensitivity of your results to those things. And here's the thing that people don't get, is that your results in an MSc, as long as there's reasonable exchange between these areas, it's really robust. to these various scenarios, surprisingly so. The real benefit of doing this is that you can make your model parametrically a lot more concise if you can do it. So I think the most important use for this is model initialization. So if you were considering a model like this, I would say construct one of these, not to say that this is the truth, but just to start your model at an approximately sensible level of fishing mortality rate. And that's what we do for bluefin, and it basically stops a model from doing crazy things, but more likely and more reliably, it reaches the same answer quicker, much, much faster. So this has proven to be a really good practical trick in bluefin. And so basically what you're doing is you're saying, we're going to initialize our model with an apical F that's estimated by this master index. We just divide whatever fleet catches are by that. And then we have a catchability, and that's going to be our apical F. So essentially, although there's up to 32,000 F parameters that you could estimate in our model for bluefin, if you use this approach, you initialize it with just 17. Just this Q by fleet, because every single stratum, space and time, where you have a master index, which is everywhere, you can just divide any catch observation by it. This is just pure magic for initializing models. I highly recommend it. It really solved a lot of our problems, and it means that you can get reliable results from a model that takes a bit longer to run. What you can't afford to do is have a model that takes a long time to run and doesn't give you reliable results. That's like a toxic combination. It's bad enough if it takes a long time to run. So consider trying to do something like this. I definitely recommend that. So far with bluefin, we've decided it's necessary. We can't divide up the stocks. We're making an operating model so we can do some pretty wacky and wild things with spatial structure, and we sort of need to, because the group has got lots of things they'd like to investigate that are wacky and wild. We can't get away with implicit spatial structure because of this nature of mixing and the interaction of fleets, and we've decided to use a smarty pants approach to initializing the model. The first thing to think about now is what's the simplest spatial model I can get away with. Not the most complicated or sophisticated, the simplest first. And of course, by far the simplest is just to have fractions. So here we have 4 seasons, and all we're going to say is for season 1, that's the subscript here, there's a fraction theta across all these areas here. And of course, the last area, we don't have to specify a parameter because it's just 1 minus the sum of these. So this is really simple approach. You can do this with a logistic model, and you just got the simplest way of divvying up spatial distribution by season. And the fractions approach should almost be the starting point that you choose. It's very close to implicit spatial structure approach, but I think this is the first port of call for anyone doing this type of modeling, because if you can't do this, then you've got real problems. Let's just focus on a single movement scenario where we're just getting the fractions for an individual season here. The good news about this is it's extremely parametrically concise. I mean, you've really only got 40 parameters for bluefin for a really big, complicated model. Of course, the huge problem with it is it can't retain the same biomass in each of these areas. So you can't have heterogeneity and trend. You can't have regional depletions. You can't have any cyclical movement dynamics. All you're doing is just washing the same model estimated biomass through these fractions. And so it has an instant refresh in terms of mixing. And for bluefin, we sort of know that's not true between seasons. There can be very high retentions in certain areas. So the next idea you've got is, can I do a simplified adaptation of this type of movement approach? What about a gravity model? This is something we developed to deal with exactly this issue. And you've got all the same parameters you've seen before. You've got a theta in each column, which is now a sort of propensity to go to that area, a gravity. But down the positive diagonal, you've got a single other parameter, a residency parameter or something similar. And all this does is it means that you can have retention in these areas. There's a big assumption attached to that. But what's remarkable about this parameterization is just how close it gets to mimicking quite complicated movement dynamics. I've sim tested this, so I've created really crazy movement scenarios, and you can get very, very close to spatial distribution and viscosity with this parameterization. And it's only one more parameter more than the simple fractions model. And so it's 48 parameters for Bluefin, and this is our default model that we use. So this is because, as you're going to see, it's not going to be possible to do this for the full parameter for each cell in this movement matrix. So the good news is we can account for viscosity now, and we can have creatures staying put in one area. The big problem with it is that this whole calculation, this assumption here, says that the propensity to stay put is going to be relative or proportional to the gravity weight in that area. And that's kind of a big assumption, but that's the one it makes. And of course you can test it in your sim testing to see how well it works or it doesn't. A really powerful aspect of this is you can actually estimate these parameters from only index data. And I'll say it again, only index data, as long as your index data is standardized across the areas, meaning that the value in one area tells you the relative abundance with the value in another area. Think about that. That means if you're smart about your CPUE standardization, you can spatially model fisheries using this. And so it's remarkably easy to estimate reliably from quite limited data. And again, that's another reason why we have to use it for Bluefin. Of course, what you might want to do is the full-on Markov matrix, where you have a parameter for every single cell minus the final column, of course, because that final column is just, again, it's the summation, 1 minus summation of everything before there. You might want to do that, but the problem is, it may be flexible. It may allow you to have creatures moving throughout this matrix through seasons, but for Bluefin tuna, that's 280 parameters if you've only got one age class. If you've got 3 age classes, you're knocking on the door of 600 parameters from just about as many transition data points. It's not possible. So, this may seem like an attractive way of doing modeling because of its flexibility, but in reality, you need a fantastically large amount of data and comprehensive data to do it justice. One hack that I highly recommend for anyone working in big pelagic fisheries with conventional tagging programs is just use the conventional tagging data to preclude things. So for example, in Bluefin tuna, we don't really trust our conventional tagging data to tell us much about exploitation rate and abundance. But what we do trust is that it has somehow recorded at one stage or other a possible movement, because there's been hundreds of thousands of tags put into place. So if you haven't seen a transition in your conventional tagging data, you might just be able to assume it doesn't exist in your movement model. And we did this for Bluefin. Even though we derived this with the gravity model, we could remove 40% of the possible transitions just by using the conventional tagging data. That saves you a huge amount of model instability, believe it or not. And it constrains it to only things that we've seen previously. For better or worse, it's a really nice trick that you can employ to make things simpler. Just a note about 2-area models. If someone asks you to do an area-based model, do a 2-area model. It's a really very special case of a spatial model. And that's just simply because you've got one parameter for every area. It's so special. And when I say this, it's because I'm asked to review on a kind of twice-yearly basis a paper drawing conclusions about spatial modeling in general from a 2-area model. 2-area models are nothing like 3-area models, which can suddenly have fish moving from one area and back to another. This isn't like that at all. And so 2-area models are super special, and they have the same property as that gravity model in the sense that you can fit them to just indices if those indices are spatially standardized. So 2-area models are gold. They meet your requirement, your promise to do some kind of area-based modeling. They allow you to adjust for the most simple way to do with mixing in between 2 areas, but they have this unusual property that they're very easily estimated, the parameters. but do not get the wool pulled over your eyes. If someone tells you a bunch of results for a 2-area model, just say that's not a characteristic spatial model. It's certainly not a general conclusion. So anyway, that's that. So in general, I would seriously consider one of these simpler models, and you could sim test it to see how well it performs. And again, this is going to be a recommendation you see in a minute, but that's a really powerful catch-all for this type of thing. Try and limit the number of movements you think are possible. Impose any constraints that you think you have. So in bluefin, we know that Western fish can't go to the Mediterranean and Eastern fish can't go to the Gulf of Mexico. So just flat out exclude that stuff. Don't think your model's going to resolve that for you. Just fix it. And of course, avoid the disappearing fish syndrome. Anytime you see a movement matrix where a row is all zeros, that means a fish can enter that area and then it just disappears. Okay, so just as someone who peer reviews spatial models, trust me, that's one of the first things you want to look for: a big row of zeros and a black hole where fish just go. I haven't talked about, these are all bulk transfer models that move fish between boxes. I haven't talked to you about affection diffusion models, and that's simply because I'm not that experienced in it. My experience that I have had is one of not being able to resolve the boundary constraints for the affection diffusion equations in a satisfactory way. So that's the only experience I've had, but there are ways of doing quite complicated spatial modeling using more fine scale models, and I'm not talking about them here, sorry. So on to our last point, and it's the big one, but you've done all this, you've used the simplified spatial assumption, even the simplest you can do. Are you really sure that your model can be informed by the data you've got? So a tip here is to, wherever possible, when we're talking about the data, try and get your indices to span areas. Don't use conventional tagging data to estimate exploitation rate unless you're really confident about reporting rates. They vary a lot in lots of fisheries, they vary over time, and they can majorly upset your estimation of those other parameters. And so I just, imagine you've got one fleet that reports 1 in every 10 tags, another, 1 in every 2 tags. That essentially, if you didn't know that would essentially have a tension in your model in the exploitation estimates of a 5-fold factor. And that just tears a model apart. You get really bad conversion diagnostics and the whole thing just doesn't work. So conventional tagging data can be really a dangerous business. Do the exclusion of movements. A word of warning, don't count your chickens, because if you go, okay, we've got all this electronic tagging data, so we know a lot about movement. Yeah, but do you have stock of origin attached to that tagging data? Because if you don't, it's just fish moving in the ocean. And so, a lot of people say we should be able to do a lot with these data, but what they don't have is the covariate stock of origin data for those tags. And then it's game over. There's suddenly lost a whole bunch of information content that you need. What you can do is look at an archival tag or electronic tag and look at its passage and try and characterize it based on those movements. And we created an algorithm to do this. It's kind of like a neural net. And it just looks for tracks that it thinks are of east and west origin. And it got a really high success rate in identifying stock of origin just based on the seasonal pattern of movement recorded in that track. Be really careful about stock of origin data. People are going to tell you they've got assignment scores, and they'll use things like otolith microchemistry and genetics to do that. And those data will look like this. Here we've got the western stock, Gulf of Mexico, and here's the eastern stock. And these are frequencies of assignments by fish. And so these are natal areas. For this blue bar here, no med fish ever goes in the Gulf of Mexico, and yet it's almost 50% eastern. So these are really uncertain data, and it's not clear how to interpret them. And actually, the people who derive these data sets aren't particularly sure what the correct likelihood function should be. The reason it's a problem is that in areas where they get uncertain, particularly chemical data, which is kind of more about where they were reared, because it's the chemical signature. If you've got a situation where one of your stocks is way smaller than the other, as that error increases, what happens is you start to say there must be a huge fraction relatively of the small stock going there to get you those uncertain stock of origin data. So it has this really nasty interaction, the error structure, with multi-stock problems where you have big differences in magnitude. The way to deal with this to a certain extent is to take the signature here of the West and the East, for example, and then interpret a new data set, the gray one, as some ratio of those things. And we had to develop something like this because otherwise we wouldn't have been able to get out those data into the model at all. And so just caution about stock of origin, and especially a caution with stock of origin data where you have stocks of very different magnitude, because they will mess with the movement estimates. So this is, you're in the Wild West with these models. You're not gonna, you're not going to, there are no general rules of thumb. People can draw CPE against catch data and say there's not much contrast in those data for a single stock assessment. Okay, but you're not going to have that novelty. You're not going to have that luxury. So you absolutely have to program your model so that it generates data for every observation you see, i.e. it does a self-test. You have to make it so it can create a data file that looks exactly like the one it reads in for testing itself. There are no rules of thumb. You're not going to know whether you've got the data weighting right. You're not going to know whether there's sufficient information. It's just a mishmash of information that gets you to that seasonal spatial distribution. Indices, stock of origin, electronic tags, all that stuff interact in a way that it just simply cannot process intuitively. So you have to do the sim test, the self-test. Parameterization is really important. You can get away with quite stupid and lazy parameterization in a regular stock assessment. For example, in a multi-stock, you might be tempted to have your unfished stock size, so this is roughly the magnitude stock 1, against the unfished stock size for stock 2. And of course, what happens is they have a negative relationship. You can have lots of one and explain the data and not much of the other, and vice versa. This is bad. This is bad stuff. This is bad juju, right? So what you should do is parameterize it so that you have a total R0 and some fraction of those, and then you get the nice fried egg. So the red stuff on this side is not great, and this is a bit better. And so try and do stuff like this. People's custom models, you see people all the time trying to estimate fishing mortality rate for a fleet in a particular year and the same fishing mortality rate in the subsequent year, as though these are somehow independent. But of course, they're correlated with stock size. They're both big when R0 is small, you're catching lots, and they're both small when R0 is large. So you have this horrible parameter space to try and navigate. Don't do that. Have a mean over the whole fleet. Have a mean F and deviations from it. And you end up with these nice fried eggs. Okay, so these types of parameterizations, you can sort of get away with this nonsense in an individual model stock assessment. You won't get away with it in a multi-stock model. It's just too many axes of correlated parameters. And similarly, if you're going to have a mean F approach and a total R0, they look like this, of course. Again, it's the same negative problem. You have lots of stock and a low mean F. Instead, think of another parameterization where you have your mean F on the x-axis and some summation of the two or multiplication of the two as a new parameter. And then you end up with your nice fried egg. Until I did something like this, the model wouldn't work. It wouldn't work. And I see people's multi-stock spatial models failing, and I see this all the time. So, be smart about parameterization. You're well out of your depth if you're trying to do stuff like this. These problems have got really nasty correlations, and the information doesn't let you pass these out easily unless you get this right. And your model will take way too long to converge in its results, if at all, if you end up with this sort of thing across thousands of parameters. Think about doing multiple phases, and you can use relaxation. So if you want to fit certain data progressively, you can just ease up the priors and the precision in data as you go through multiple phases. That could actually save you. It saved us. You shouldn't have to do it, but you do. If you want age-dependent movement, make them deviations from one of the age classes. So you can make them all the same in the first phase and then allow for, at the end, age-dependent movement as a deviation away from some central age movement. That also means that when you don't have data, it will just defer to that default age movement. when you run this model, it's going to take a long time. Use initialization files and just start at the last estimation phase. So what happens is people set this thing up. It has like 6 phases in it, and that gets you all the way to a set of plausible parameter values. And then they do the whole thing again for all their sensitivity analysis. Don't do that. Don't do that. Just start right at the end, the last phase. It's going to save you 5 phases of estimation. Just start right at the end and start from initial values. I see this all the time in stock synthesis models. I don't know why people do it in their assessments, but it will make a slow model a little less slow. And if you've only got length comp data, you probably can't distinguish between adjacent recruitment deviations. You might want to consider blocking them or having some sort of model to model your recruitments, because otherwise you end up in a situation where, because of smearing across an age length key, you can't distinguish a length comp signature from one year recruitment cohort straight from another. So it's really key to think about these things, because just this simple thing could screw up your whole model. And in an operating model, you could probably get away with doing some blocking. We did it. I know it was dense. Sorry about that. But we got through all these points. We got to the end of it, and some tips and tricks. Just a few last slide, I promise. A few additional things to think about. Remember that when we talk about things like salmon and bluefin, we're talking about species for which there is stock-specific regions. So we do have access to stock-specific data. And that's an exception in a certain sense. And so it could actually be a lot worse than I've made out. You may have no signature of the individual species, no CPUE, no survey. And so what I'm presenting here is in some ways been helped a lot by having that type of information. People don't know how to interpret the spatial distributions. So people said, there's no way you can only have 40% of the fish in the sporting season in one of these seasons. But of course, the 40% means the average for the purposes of calculating F and things like that. These models aren't telling you how much is in there. It's telling you what the mean amount that was in there. So you could actually have 80% just for half of the season, and that's how you got your 40%. All I'm telling you is that this model is going to have results in it that people cannot understand. And the same people that liked you in the first instance, the biologists and ecologists, are going to just be dumbfounded. This also happens when they find out things like alternative spawning grounds and things like this. Your biggest proponents now can't see any sensitivity to the things they really dearly care about, like maturity and spawning grounds. It won't make a difference, probably. And so you get into that tricky spot. And also, how on earth are you going to estimate your MSY reference points? I mean, for most of the time, this is just not well resolved in multi-stock fisheries, not the least of which people can't interpret those. And also, you can have really nasty cyclical behavior as well. It's not impossible that if you've modeled non-independence, this thing will never be stable in a way you want it to be for calculating MSY. Good luck with that. And at the end of it, they may have to make really hard decisions about one stock versus another. And of course, that could be very political. I'm not going to comment on that, but it can be extremely political. The biggest issue is that although sub-stock structure is clearly something that may be really important, there's not a lot of incentives for learning about it. Like, it's from a manager's perspective, you kind of don't want to know. You just kind of want to put your head in the sand. And so, you won't be very popular at the end of this, is what I'm trying to tell you. Or at least I wasn't. And so finally, I just want to say, going back to my roadmap, it's a huge descent down here from this, this honeymoon period all the way down to it. And there's this low point, which has happened recently, where I've had to defend this monstrous model. But the good news is there's light at the end of the tunnel, because you get to do a lesson learned seminar like this one, and you sort of get to purge all of your worries and things you've been thinking about for the last 3 or 4 years. I do apologize it's so dense necessarily. Murdoch gave a very long introduction, but in the remaining time we have left, and I'm happy to stay on, I'm very happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tom. Fantastic talk, really informative from your experience. So please, let's have some questions. Who'd like to start?
I have one if nobody wants to jump in.
Go ahead.
Thanks, Tom. That was very clear and pretty easy to follow along despite your early warnings. In your gravity modeling section, you talked about the value of one additional parameter when you're starting from a pretty simple starting point and when that one additional parameter is carefully thought out. I'm wondering if you've taken that same principle and applied it to your master index. Maybe 17 parameters can be thought of as a fairly simple starting point. Have you looked at adding slightly more complexity, going to 18 or 19 or 20 parameters, and seeing whether that provides any value?
Very good question. So essentially what we did. So the problem with the master index is that if you think about it, because you're trying to get your apical Fs from the same index, you can't track different trends of fishing mortality rate dependent on their vulnerability. So you might have a fleet looking for only small fish. You might have a fleet that targets only large fish. They're not going to have the same trend in apical F. So what we did is we actually parameterized it. So it initializes with it, and then it subsequently adds deviations from that, which means that you can get different trends and you can get different magnitudes. So we did exactly what you're saying, and we did it in essentially random effects for that helped you get near trend, and we did fixed effects for the magnitude difference between the different areas. But yeah, so we did exactly what you're saying, and we got somewhere between a full-on F estimating 32,000 Fs, which I refused to do, and this kind of 17 parameter thing. And the good news about doing it the way we did is you can relax it. So you can start it out from that, and then you can, in the subsequent estimation phases, you can add variance to those additions to the apical F. So we did exactly what you're suggesting. Thanks for the lead into that answer.
Thanks. That covers all my sub questions that were related to random effects on that.
Tom, I'll ask a question. For bluefin tuna in the Atlantic, and actually most tunas, we rely a lot on fishery-dependent data. Like there are virtually no fishery-independent indices. Could say, oh, the larval index in the Gulf of Mexico for the Western stock is fishery-independent, but that's really highly variable. And so for trends in abundance by area by season, it seems that you're cursed with all these fishery-dependent data, and you have issues of sort of nasty things going on within those areas in terms of hyperstability or hyperdepletion and so on. So how do you deal with that in terms of like interpreting the data in your observation air models and so on?
Okay, so first point, as this is the problem with fishery science at the moment in terms of the quantitative aspect of it. Recent estimation tools, things like TNB, have allowed us to fit very complicated models. And the problem is with those models is the more complicated the model, the more vulnerable it is to a breaking of its various assumptions. Like it just doesn't, it can do crazy things. And therefore, the bigger the disparity between how well you expect it to perform, whereas what happens in reality. And so what actually happens is what you're talking about, is when you sim test a model like this, it does fine. But the moment you actually give it the crappy, problematic, hyperstable, indices it's actually got to work with, it finds meaning where there is none in a way that it would never do in a simulation test. So for example, it says, okay, this index has got this vulnerability then, and I'm going to have a recruitment pulse, and it will make sense of what you give it. It will make sense of the chaos you give it, but it will do it in a way that is not reliable. And so it's a good question what you're saying. The way we deal with it is we deal with different weightings. So what I do is identify various indices with different, that can sort of be considered a group, and you just come up with different operating models for those different groups of indices. That's probably the best formal way of dealing with it in fisheries, because it front loads the uncertainty, and then you look for an NP robustness. In terms of the observation models, we basically model autocorrelation and in the residuals and the error in the residuals. And then we can have, and you turn it on, we then have also hyperstability if you want it. So we estimate it based on the model fits. So essentially every simulation is different. And then in the future, we preserve those quantities for generation of future data. So the default is precision and autocorrelation, and then for one of the robustness scenarios, we turn on hyperstability, hyperdepletion.
Tom, there's a question from Oliver in the chat box.
Oh, I don't have access to the chat box, sorry. I'm looking right now right there. Sorry, guys. Okay. What is the prime experience that caused you to be so cautious with regards to investing, modeling dead ends, and directing you towards high-level thought experiments to vet modeling approaches? You know, Bluefin's an interesting example because it was a top-down process, and I'm contracted on an annual basis to do it. So I don't have any guilty conscience about having convinced people to do these things. But fisheries science is a place littered with people that are compromised because they've sold an idea that they can't deliver on. And that is not a good place to be. Those people are miserable. And it's really looking at other people finding their way into awkward modeling philosophies, which they've oversold, that's maybe think personally it's not worth it. I mean, you know, unfortunately, we exist in a discipline where the peer review system is dubious. You can get stuff published that isn't watertight, and you can get funding to do stuff that isn't watertight. And at this point, the only thing is your own self-criticism and how happy you are to live with it. And I just know a lot of unhappy people that are in parts of our field where they are doing stuff they know better than anyone. Remember, they know better than anyone is flawed. And it scares the willies out of me, frankly.
Are there some additional questions?
I can jump in again. Tom, you had a recommendation near the end about taking your final values from your main run and using those as initial values in your sensitivity runs, which can be a huge time saver.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, if you come at it from a perspective that sensitivity analyses might allow you to discover things you did not anticipate, is there a risk that if there's a global maximum elsewhere, that starting at what might be a local maximum might get you stuck in those sensitivities?
Yeah. So the process I've generally gone through is I do everything fitted from all phases to start with, and then basically I'll then if there's any marginal changes, I'll assume that they're okay. But I've used the first fits and the first sensitivities to just validate that the method works. The only reason I say that is that sounds like duplicative, but it's actually not. In Bluefin, I'm asked to tweak. You wouldn't believe the number of times people have changed one data point in literally 500,000 and said refit it. And in those cases, I don't feel as insecure about taking the you know what I mean? I don't feel as bad about taking the NPD estimates and initializing the model in the final phase. But I think the point you're making is absolutely right. You'll never actually know for sure whether or not you're trapped in some local minima. All I will say about the model is if you get your parameterization right and you've done your sim testing correctly, you've guarded yourself against that problem, hopefully, and you're hoping you've got an objective function surface that's navigable from different starting points, and it shouldn't matter too much. All you're doing essentially is just speeding up how long it takes you to get there. But look, it's a valid point, and the recommendation is really just about that situation where you're doing a lot of repeat runs with fractional changes.
Great, thanks.
But your really key recommendation there, Tom, was to try to reparameterize the bloody model so that that correlation structure that causes false convergence to multiple points along a flat likelihood ridge, that you avoid that.
Yeah, I think it plagues a lot of fisheries models. I mean, I don't know what's happened. I haven't reviewed a stock synthesis model for about 4 years, but the last 3 that I reviewed had really ridged correlations between the F parameters, and I just thought to myself, this is lunacy. So, and it's just, it doesn't have to be like that. And, you know, so I think for Pacific Cake, they were running the model for 2 weeks to get the NPDES, to get the MCMC. And it's just not necessary.
Well, it's going to fail in the end. It isn't going to work no matter how long you run it. It's just crazy.
Yeah, and it's funny because I know you probably teach it, but I didn't manage to get through fisheries. I managed to get through fisheries quantitative stuff without actually fully grasping the absolutely vital importance of parameterization. And it's only, I've got to say, one of these problems like bluefin, it's a nightmare in some ways, and another way you come out of it and you're ready for anything. And it's been a trial by fire, but it's been excellent in that regard. And the only reason I would say to people to get involved in something like this is that you learn a heck of a lot about how to do these sorts of things. You might not want to do it again, but you learn a heck of a lot.
Tom, I just got a question on one of your comments, which I don't want, let's say, graduate students to maybe misinterpret it. You seem to be saying that in a couple of instances with regards to fitting models to data, if it's an MSc and you have an operating model, you can get away with lower standards in terms of, let's say, diagnostics or whatever than you can if it's a stock assessment setting.
Well, the reason I say that is because in other settings like SBT, IWC, R1s and similar, what you can do is, here's the problem. You're going to need an operating model that's flexible enough to consider all the various things that people want to specify. So they might want to say, we want this seasonal distribution just to see if it matters. And so what will happen is you end up in a model that can do, as you described, give you estimates that are hard to defend. The only reason that you can avoid it in MSc as a necessary endpoint to the process is if it doesn't matter. And I brought it up specifically for spatial structure because in my experience, spatial structure is one of the least important things for determining the difference in MP performance. So basically a lot of people commented on these little colored boxes I showed you. What we did is we specified priors that had radically different scenarios, and it just didn't make any difference at all to MP performance. In which case, what you could say is it's not defensible. It's not easily defensible because the inference has come from all these different data sources combined. So you can't say why it is what it is, but you do know it's not influential. And that's the only reason I say it. It's just that MSc gives you a way of knowing whether or not it's something to worry about. But look, you're right, I don't want to give the idea you can get away with crappy modeling in operating models. It's just, you won't be asked to defend every single last estimate, is really what I meant.
Well, what you could be doing and should be doing in those kind of cases is showing that when they get worried about their parameter estimate, to show that it won't matter to the decisions that they have available to them.
Yeah.
You choose the setting and I'll give you the policies that'll work best. And then you do that about 5 times with different settings from different people, and then they realize,
That's exactly the phase we just went through for Bluefin. So people didn't like things, but remember that and this is always the question to remind people on the score. Someone says, I don't like that model estimate. The first thing you say is, well, what information and data are you privy to that is not already in this model fitting? Because empirically it's fitted to all the data that we think we have. So where is this other data? And if you don't have it, then what's your basis? So put the burden of proof on them. So what's your proof or evidence that this is insufficient? But then, of course, you
keep coming back and to them pointing out that it doesn't matter.
Well, that's what we did. Yeah, that's what we had to do.
Thanks. I think there's one more question from Oliver in the chat. Well, maybe go to that and then we'll finish off.
So do you view cyclical model results as a problem from the standpoint of presenting results to management stakeholders? No, it's really difficult. So this is an interesting problem. We've written a whole bunch of fishery legislation, including LRPs and other things, in a world where there's asymptotic, things can be derived asymptotically. And the problem is that in ecology, we know that's not necessarily true. In fact, we know it's almost certainly not true. In our models, we can generate these unstable multi-species models pretty easily. And so the problem with it is you're creating something that is, definitely plausible, but you just can't fit it into the bizarre legal and management frameworks that we've derived in most places, which are linked to ideas of depletion and linked to ideas of, MSY. So the answer, is if you're going to get into something like this, you've got to think about how or not the framework you're in can actually accommodate those types of outputs. I mean, usually there's a way around it. But I just, I think it's just a problem because of those frameworks in which you're trying to interpret the results. But I don't think it should be problematic from a modeling perspective. It is what it is. You have cyclical future scenarios and you can quantify management advice in terms of yield, for example. What's the problem? It's only an issue because of our management frameworks.
Okay, great.
And I
Thanks very
throw it
much.
in before you.
Oh,
Let me emphasize some of what Tom just said. Billy and I right now are working with shrimp fishermen in BC. There's a strongly cyclic dynamics out there with a 15 or so year periodicity, apparently linked to El Niños. And the stocks are going up and down by about an order of magnitude. DFO's precautionary approach involves one of these 10-40 shaped harvest control rules. In a world where there's a cycle like that, the harvest control rule tells them to shut down about half the time. You can't have a viable industry.
Well,
If you follow the kind of asymptotic model, it's catastrophic.
The solution is to move to dynamic reference points where you say this is what the unfished.
Absolutely. Sure.
Yeah, and then you can run your 40-10 rule, and then it's at least a fair basis for evaluating management options. Yeah, but you have to move to that, right? I mean, you've got no choice.
Absolutely.
So sorry, guys, if it was a bit dense. I mean, Mikey gave me some pretty good feedback. It wasn't too bad, but I wanted to get it all out. There's a lot more, but and I suspect a lot of you know this stuff already. So hopefully you didn't find it too patronizing.
Thanks a lot. Thanks again, Tom.
Yeah, thanks everybody. See ya.
Thank you.